Do we have any public comments? Call for approval of the minutes from the last meeting.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. New business.
Okay, our first audit that we have is the follow-up audit of surplus property distribution. This audit was initially done back in October of 2023. We had 5 recommendations in this audit based on the operations of the surplus property division. Those recommendations were all accepted. There was 1 high risk, 3 medium risk, and 1 low risk. Once they reported that they were implemented, we had James Carson within our office go out and verify the implementation of the recommendations. All of the recommendations were verified to be implemented. They've started inventory cycle counts. They looked into an automating inventory system, returned all of the items back to the departments that we noted, and increased their advertising to drive more business to the website. So that was the audit. We also have Velvet Hunter and Kenneth Eads here from General Services if there's any questions.
Just one. This says that you are doing a random inventory of 50 randomly selected items. Give me context. Is that out of all the properties
Out
or?
of everything in the warehouse, it's not the vehicle inventory, but it's everything in the warehouse. We do those 4, and then we do a complete inventory on the Christmas break.
Christmas
In
break.
between Christmas, so we.
And
do
like
that.
the number of things in the warehouse, is that hundreds or tens of thousands or
No, it's about 3 right now, I believe.
Okay.
Right around 30,000.
30,000?
3 or 30? 3,000.
3,000.
Okay, so
Okay.
50 random
Out of 3,000.
out of 3,000,
Yes.
okay.
Okay.
Which is normal because we would do cycle counts is what we would recommend. And so that's kind of what they're doing until they do that big inventory at the end of the year.
And that goes through everything?
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. That was my only question.
Any other questions? Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Try to stay dry.
Good luck with that.
Appreciate it.
Okay. The
Annual
next,
work plan.
yes, because we're going to skip the other 2 audits. They unfortunately all were waiting on as a response letter, but they didn't get issued for this audit committee meeting. So we'll move to the audit plan. So the audit plan is the big item that we do every year. If you remember, our audit plan runs from February to January. Our office can't do any audits without y'all's prior approval, so we put together this plan to work off throughout the year. It can be amended and changed throughout the year, but this gives us something to work off of without having to come back and ask for every single audit that we want to begin. We start this audit plan process by looking at how many hours we have with our staff, with our consulting budget. We take into consideration leave time and training. And this year it's about 11,500 hours based on our FTEs. It's slightly up from last year because we have hired more people. We take that, we distribute it across the type of work that we think we'll do for the year, follow-up audits, current audits, future audits, and then we start to actually make the plan. Our first step is what's on pages 4 through 6 of this document, where we have a risk prioritization. And we look at many different factors such as revenues, expenditures, FTEs, grant funding. Is it tied to a mayor's priority? Is it how impactful to citizens is it? We rate all departments on this. And at pages 7 and 8, you can see kind of how that risk rating comes out. It also takes into consideration when was the last time that we audited this department. You can imagine the risk rating kind of stays consistent every year because the big departments stay big and they stay impactful, like public safety departments. But sometimes there's a little bit of change, so we still look at this. The next piece that we take into consideration is something that you all probably received, which was asking for input. We ask both the Metropolitan Council, which the Vice Mayor was kind enough to amplify that this year for us, as well as department heads. And we have a ways for people to report through our website as well. If anybody has any ideas, and it's not necessarily at the department level, but anybody within Metro, they can report it anonymously, kind of like they can report fraud allegations. So we have these different ways that people can submit ideas. We also take into consideration other big audits that happened across other local government audit shops. or other risk areas that certain organizations identify as big risk areas for the year. So we take all this information and we try to come up with an audit plan to hit impactful items, and that's what's on pages 1 and 2, and then 3 is the extra list. So I'm gonna go through each of them and tell you why they're on the audit plan, and then if you have questions, stop me along the way. The first portion of this at the top relates to audits that we already have going on right now. We have to complete those. They're carrying over from last year. These are ones that will actually need hours put towards them. We do have a couple of draft reports that literally just need a response letter, so they're not listed on here because there's not really any time going into them. So that's that top part. Next is the actual new audits. The first 3 are ones from last year. The first one is criminal court clerk. We did try to start this one back in January, but unfortunately for us, fortunately for her, the key contact went on maternity leave literally the week that we announced the audit. And so we worked with the criminal court clerk. They were very responsive and welcoming, but at the same time, it's inefficient for us to try to work without her there. So that one got moved forward. We have credit card spending, which is another one we've discussed as an audit committee. And the last one is Titan Stadium. This one technically has been started, but these are going to be interim audits that y'all get throughout the year. So we continued them on the new audits because our consultants, Craft, will be issuing those throughout the year. So let's move on to the new ones. The first one's Nashville Fairgrounds, and this is cash collections and vendor contract fulfillment. Nashville Fairgrounds was already on our radar because we have not been out there in at least almost 10 years. And so we then got 2 submissions for audit ideas related to Nashville Fairgrounds. That was vendor contract fulfillment and cash collections. And so that's a good scope for an audit out there. So that was why we put that one on there. The next one is the fleet program.
Thank you.
It's, as we discussed at the last audit committee meeting. So that one went on there. That's going to look at all of fleet across Metro, as we did identify issues at the fire audit. So let's do it across all of Metro. Number 6 is the health department opioid settlements. We had 2 individuals contact us with this idea. Basically, my understanding is the committee has kind of pointed the direction that this funding should be spent. It's about $5.6 million. And so we would go out there and make sure that there's mechanisms in place to ensure it's being spent appropriately, that the outcomes of it are being measured, so that if it is being used for certain purposes, that somebody is monitoring it to make sure that the intended results are happening. And
Does
if
the
they're
council not appropriate those funds or have approval for that?
Well, my understanding is there was a committee that actually sent it to the health department and said what it was supposed to be used
I mean,
for.
we got a very large list of
Yeah.
like 25 things or something
Yep.
at one time.
So we're just making sure that those 25 things that we said is what they're actually doing? Is
Yes,
that?
and that
okay.
they have mechanisms in place and processes in place to measure it, because I mean,
Okay.
if they need to change it up or they need to go back and ask for any approval
Yeah.
to make changes, that it
Yeah,
happens.
okay.
So that, like I said, 2 people did request that one. The next one is Metro Government Harassment, Discrimination, and Retaliation Investigation Practices. This was also brought up in 2 different discussions that I had. We know that harassment complaints and other complaints are lodged, but we're unclear on the process, and it's a very important process. And how do you make sure that those that have these complaints feel comfortable reporting them? How do they know where they're supposed to report them? And then the process, because even in our work, when we get complaints such as this, we're going to refer them to other processes, but we want to make sure that we're protecting those employees if they've come to us even. And so it would be looking through that. This would be a large audit because it's going to encompass Metro, but it's also going to encompass MMPD, who may have a different process, just thinking there may be multiple processes, we don't know. But it's an important process for these, make sure that they're handled correctly.
So that would at the least be MNPD and HR, Metro
Yes,
HR. Right?
exactly.
Not MMPS?
We would not do MMPS for this one because I think that would maybe too far out of our scope. We could, if it was requested that we include it. Like I said, it's already a big audit, but we can make it, I mean, we could do it there as well.
Well, I mean, I just feel like I have employees that have come to me worried about feeling comfortable addressing certain things for fear of retaliation. That's, concerning. So I would say while you're doing it, may as well, I mean,
Okay, we can do that.
When you say large audit, how many hours are you talking about?
That one I'm not sure about. I mean, our larger audits used to be around 1,000 hours, but it's probably we would probably put multiple people on this project, whereas normally we can have one person lead an entire audit. This would be a multiple person audit, so we're getting into like 1,500 hours around there.
I would suggest too that, I'm sorry, Tom, go ahead.
Okay. So if we add another component to it, how many more hours is that?
I mean, we probably talk, well, it all depends, because sometimes they follow similar processes. If you have a pretty streamlined process, it can be pretty efficient, but at the same time, I mean, we're talking like, it may get up to about 2,000 hours on that one. But we can still, we can still do it. And like I said, we're
We used to
hiring
be doing it
people.
for a while.
Like that, and I mean, we can increase the size of the team. We are hiring one more person anyway, and so it's something that we could increase the size of the team.
I would suggest that you actually make it two different audits. One is the general government and one is MMPS, because I do believe there's different policies and procedures in place at both entities, and so it may make more sense to split it and do one that's MMPS kind of centric and one that's general government centric.
That's a good suggestion.
Okay. The next one is MMPD traffic enforcement. This one was requested by Councilmember Cupin, based on the work that he's been doing and also the council discussions around traffic enforcement. When I researched this one, there are some other local governments that have already done this type of audit where a lot of other cities have seen a sharp decline in traffic enforcement, and looking at the effects of that, but also taking into consideration MMPD is short-staffed. How are they deciding what to prioritize, and what are the effects of prioritizing different work? So that's what that one would be encompassing.
I think, sorry to interrupt, but
No, go ahead.
I didn't.
Please.
I wonder if it would be appropriate, I mean, I want to know the answers to these questions, but we just recently passed a resolution, which was really irritating to me, by the way, but asking police to increase enforcement for traffic on the heels of a 2017, was that the Driving While Black report? Which is one of the contributing factors of reducing those things, and so they are short-staffed, no question about it. But I think there was some purposeful, possibly to avoid that as well. So now that we've just changed our tune and requested something of them, would it be appropriate to let them figure that out before we audit? I wonder if this is just premature, even if it's a few months, just to let them look at it, look at their staffing, figure out how they're gonna do that and balance the stuff. That's the only thing that I would say about that.
Okay. If y'all decide to keep it on the plan, we could prioritize it to happen later in the year, closer to the end of our audit plan year, which would be, December or January.
Or alternatively, is there a way to do it so that we get some before and after data, maybe? Would that be useful?
Well, either way, whenever we start it, I mean, if we started it later, we would have the before data for sure. We would have the start of the after data. It is also something that could be pushed. Even if we did it next year, then we would have more after data, but we would still have our scope period would still include the before as well.
And MNPD has all this data. I mean, it's just a matter of
Exactly.
asking them. Most of it is actually on the website. So this is good. Should be a pretty easy one. But if we want to learn more about their processes on how they're prioritizing and yada yada, then that's. But I want to say, just give them the opportunity to create that process.
Okay. The next one is the Metro Action Commission Head Start program. This is another department that we have not audited in over 10 years. It's a large department and a risky department because of the different populations that they serve. They do get a lot of federal funding as well as Metro funding. We had 2 submissions for audit ideas with the Head Start program because it's one of their larger programs, and there's certain information because it is federally funded we wouldn't have access to, such as the qualification for the program necessarily. We're not allowed to have that kind of information, but we can still look at the processes around the programs that they run, the individuals that they are allowing to work with these children, and other pieces like that we would look at for this to make sure that they have processes in place to monitor the expectations and goals of the program. The next one is WeGo Public Transit Bus Operations and Performance Indicators. With the passing, we haven't looked at WeGo in a while. It's a large organization. With the passing of the transit referendum, the information coming out of WeGo is going to be important because the information can be relied upon to make decisions with that transit referendum funding. So those performance indicators, they're using timeliness and ridership and other information. We want to make sure that that's accurately captured and accurately reported. The other thing is that if bus operations increase, we want to make sure that there's safety involved and training of those bus operators, and that there's processes in place to keep the riders on those buses safe. So that's why we have that one on there. Next is the yes.
Oh, may I pose a question, Chairman,
Please.
in between? So for that, and then comparatively, like when you're looking back and saying it's been a while since we've audited this
Yes.
entity, and I understand for large organizations and for continuity, do you make sure, though there's forward-looking questions, right? Things that have been elevated in this moment. When we kind of touch a department again in a routine, do we make sure then for kind of apples to apples that we go back and look at how they used to or did or are currently recording ridership and timeliness?
Yes.
Like, so basically so that, not that the audits have to speak to each other, but kind of
Yes.
that we look at what we did last time, catch that up, and then any other forward-looking questions can be
Yes,
added.
exactly.
Okay.
One of the pieces of an audit that we have to do with every single one when we're planning it is we have to go back and look at other audits to
Okay.
make sure that any information we learned in that last audit that we can apply, or if anything has changed, to make sure that we capture those changes
Right.
and understand them.
Right, because I would imagine systems-wise, like
Yes.
right now, they have the quick ticket system versus previously they were money-based.
Yes.
Okay.
The next one is Historical Commission. This is one where it's similar to Criminal Court Clerk. It's on here because we haven't been out there in about 10 years, but it's a smaller audit that we usually use these kind of audits for training audits with some of our newer staff. It's not really scoped yet because what they'll go out there and do is, one, they'll make sure that the Historical Commission is operating and meeting the expectations of Metro finance policies and some of the other payroll stuff, because these are things that we can learn, we can teach our newer auditors on, as well as look at some other key processes, like if it's plan review or if it's commission meetings, make sure the commission is meeting the requirements for themselves. So that's why that one is on there. That's a smaller audit that we have. Yes.
Go ahead, Ms. Allen, you
Just sort of in light of some conversations that we're having now about Historical Commission, is it at all appropriate to delve into issues of consistency of application of guidelines? I mean, that may be totally out of your
A lot of
bailiwick,
time,
but I think that's.
sometimes with boards and commissions, we will look to see what their policies are that they're supposed to be following. It is a little bit difficult sometimes when it's subjective decision-making that they're doing. So we can't necessarily say whether or not unless it is pretty clear-cut, whether or not they're staying within the guidelines of what they're supposed to be making decisions on is what we would look at.
Yeah, they're kind of 40-something different sets of guidelines. It makes it tricky.
Chairman, if I may, building on Ms. Allen's question, I guess I would kind of point out that the Historical Commission and the Historic Zoning Commission are not one and the
Yes.
same. And so when you're talking about permit review, I would presume that's a
zoning, yes.
Historic
Yeah.
Zoning Commission. And so I know they have kind of some of the same support staff or organizational structure. But I would ask or encourage us to be kind of explicit as,
Okay.
which, is it both? Is it one? And so, yeah.
So put an S after that, or?
Right.
We could put Historical Commission and Historic Zoning Commission and just kind of encompass it into one piece and then look at the different processes within each of those.
Right, I mean, I would presume organizationally, they have some joint
Yes.
processes. I don't actually know how they manage that, whether it be payroll and expenditure, but I would presume that permit review is only under the auspices of the zoning commission, although I guess, I can't speak to that. Former planning and zoning chair Allen, can you?
I mean, I don't know that I always separated the two, but in my mind, what came to us was from the Historic Zoning Commission, so, but I can't swear to it, so.
We can put them both on there, and that way, if we can root through through that and figure it out.
Right,
through the
and I
audit.
would say just, in adding that, the intent would not be to magnify necessarily the scope, but just to make sure that it was not, constrained in such a way that like, oh, well, that's only
Only
this.
this will be-
Yeah, yeah, okay.
The next is the sheriff's felon housing cost settlement calculation. So basically, the sheriff's office will house certain inmates that the state asks them to house that are not local to Metro, but the state reimburses the sheriff's office for this. There's a complex calculation to determine what the cost and care of those inmates is, and so it's important that that is correct. Because it does have impacts on Metro, and Metro wants to make sure that we're maximizing the amount of money that we receive. So we've put this one on there. This was actually on there, it's been a few years, but it dropped off because we just didn't have the resources to do it at the time. But we have put it back on here. We are considering using one of our consultants to do this because it is complex financial calculations and weeding through some different research. And so it may be good for some of our consultants that have strong financial it's still a performance audit, but still doing it within the financial aspects of it to get that done accurately. So that one is why that one is on there. And the last one is an audit of our office. Every 3 years, we are required to have a peer review. We put it on here because they issue a report, and that way that we make sure that that report is on here. So we are working with the Association of Local Government Auditors to do our peer review. They send a team of 2 people over to our office to meet with our staff, to go through our records, to go through our CPE, our training logs, to make sure that we're complying with government auditing standards. And that is scheduled already to happen mid-May. So they will be coming out here. They may reach out to some of you because they also take into consideration the interactions and the oversight of our audit committee. And so that one is on here as well. And the last one is just our follow-up audits that we continue to do on a secondary basis as other projects are being completed. So those are what we have on the plan, our proposed plan. We got a lot of recommendations and submissions though, and so we have a long list in the other audits considered. I don't know if y'all want me to go through them one by one, but if you have any questions about any of them, what they would cover, why they aren't on the plan, it's always a juggling act to try to figure out what's best to go on the plan. And so these are also opportunities if there's some on there that you would like to add to the plan or make any changes.
With what you have in the plan right now, do you have a projection of how many hours that is?
It should meet about that 11,000, well, if you're including the audits that we've already done, then we've got about, with all of these different projects, it's about 9,000, 10,000 audit, or 10,000 hours.
And what is your capacity as a department?
Our capacity as a department is around 11,000 hours.
Okay, so you're full
Yes,
capacity.
with
okay.
understanding, because we leave ourselves some leeway, we have hours in there in case a special audit comes up that we put on the plan at the last minute, but then also, we do understand that sometimes things get delayed or projects, we don't know what we're getting into when we launch them, and so we do go over budget on hours.
Vice Mayor, I believe you had a question.
I would be interested, and I would defer to fellow committee members, but just kind of hitting the high points maybe, because these are just kind of barely a phrase, but just if you might, in fairness for those people who might have submitted them or wanted them to be considered, you don't have to necessarily go deep on all these, but rather than cherry picking them, Chair, I might suggest just going straight through the list and just kind of explicating it
Sure.
just a little more. Thank you.
Okay, so the first one with Parks recruiting and hiring practices, this would look at their recruiting and hiring practices. This was submitted by 2 different people for different pieces of it. Some of it was summer hiring, some of it was just overall hiring, because there is a lot of turnover within the Parks Department. One of the reasons we didn't put this on there is because we're finishing up an audit of the Parks Department, and so we thought it may be more valuable to put resources towards other departments. Solid waste services, the recycling. One of the reasons, this one was also requested or submitted, it would look at the recycling is a very it's a contracted process, and so it would be learning about the vendor requirements, which it's more of a vendor audit, and so that's why we didn't put it on there, is because it's more auditing our vendor, which my understanding is the contracts are kind of turning over, but at the same time, they're not exactly deep as far as the requirements of picking it up, but not past that, we wouldn't be able to look too much further.
Yeah, I was gonna say anything, there's a couple things on here related to waste services, and I think, we have a new director there.
Yes.
I had a really in-depth meeting with her. She's really looking at a lot of those contracts and some efficiencies and some technology and all those things, and so I think the changes that she's gonna make, whatever we would audit, would be irrelevant pretty quickly,
Yes.
I
so.
would concur with that, for sure.
The capital spending plan and capital improvements budget process. This was also submitted as an idea, and it would be kind of looking at the process behind how are you taking into consideration from council grading as far as the idea, the number, like the rankings to put
That would
into
be
this
interesting
budget.
to know.
Exactly, and going through the process and how does that filter into, is it being used to filter into the actual ending plans and budget that we see? And so that was the request on that one.
Well, and if I may, in that regard, I know somebody having served through multiple terms where we have kind of updated and changed that process through kind of multiple administrations. I feel like we had pretty good cohesion, maybe Ms. Allen, in our first term of service, maybe your second term, to take the CIB from being what has previously been called a meaningless wish list, into which everything was just sort of dumped. But then I felt like we had a change of administration. I felt like we kind of had to come apart, to be honest, and how we kind of came back to it. And it might be worthwhile just to get on paper, this is how we did it for decades. Then we did it this way. Then we stopped doing it that way, and now we do it this way. Like, it might just be worthwhile internal to our office in partnership with planning, just to sort of, again, just kind of explicate that a little bit.
Might be interesting.
I'm not sure if it's, from an audit perspective, like, I grant you it needs more explanation, I think would be helpful, but I don't know if,
I think my question is more about how, when we prioritize things, which we've, for 5 years now, 5.5, whatever, we've always done some sort of prioritization, and I know it's changed a little bit with, well, now you do this and now you do not, but we've always prioritized it, whether it was points or whatever. How does that translate into the CSP is what I want to know.
Right.
Because I can put something with 100 of my points or 1,000 points or stars or whatever we're doing, and it still doesn't get on the CSP, and quite frankly, nothing got in the CSP of mine for several years. So that's what I would like to know. It's not necessarily our process, because you can try to explain it to somebody and they're going to go, that's goofy. But how do the dollars actually get spent? And the answer to it, unfortunately, is very subjective, and it's up to the mayor. So this is why it is still a meaningless wish list, in my opinion. Just saying.
I guess the other piece of that would be, do the departments pay any attention to it? When they have money for paving or whatever, and they have 2 roads that are identically the same in terms of need and number of potholes, and they see that one council member prioritized it highly and the other council member didn't mention it, does that make a difference? Do they even bother to look?
I don't even think they look at it.
That would be nice. So those would be
I mean,
the
it's
two
on,
questions.
the paving specifically is on a schedule, and they audit those, and they'll look, and they do their own prioritization based off of,
right.
but to your-
Data, which is good.
yeah, which is
Yeah.
good, because it shouldn't be politicized, because that's really what it is. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah, and I would say for NDOT, formerly Public Works, we've had some of those conversations where the paving program, right, is very data-driven. We circle the county with the infrared scanning of the whatever, we grade the pavement, it's on a certain cycle. Like, you don't want these things, of course, to be political, right? It's very much based on that data. I think perhaps I would say that NDOT has done less well as it has attempted to programmatically address crosswalks or traffic calming or some of these things to, again, explain to council and the public how they prioritize in the crosswalk bucket, how they prioritize these school-based projects, right? Like, they need, I think, a similar level of explanation and kind of merit-based decision-making that, similar to the paving program. I mean, I would concur with that, but I do think that's something through committee and policy we might be able to kind of push on. But, you know,
I think, well, it's grossly underfunded. The paving program is grossly underfunded. And so they say, okay, you're gonna get $10 million for paving this year. And they go, okay, we got $10 million. That's gonna equate to
2 roads.
however, yeah, right, however many roads it is, and we gotta figure that out. You know, I think maybe you were saying, how does someone say, okay, how much money do you get? Or are they saying, well, right now, traffic calming is a really hot button issue, so maybe we're gonna put more money there? Like how they're dividing up their buckets, that's more of a director question, I guess, of how she's allocating, but does, so anyway.
yeah, fair.
The next one is the tree canopy funding, and this is just processes to make sure that
Did you
that
do that?
funding.
I did not ask, I'm just so excited to see all the trees being planted.
I guess my question here on this request was, is this sort of the bucket for that funding as far as tree planting and our combined Route Nashville efforts? But, I mean, just the framing of the question, like tree canopy fund, do we just mean funding tree planting?
Well, sorry, it's more along the lines of that funding, how is it being used? What are the metrics? How are they deciding what to spend it on? How are we making sure that it's actually being spent on the appropriate items for that funding is what that one is.
Okay.
We should call Mike Jameson, the tree man, and have him come.
Okay. Next is Metro Parks rental program. This is just about making sure that because they rent out a lot of their facilities. Some of the funding the money that they bring in from this was included in our Metro Parks cash collection audit that is almost issued, is in final draft phase right now, which is why we didn't include it. But it's just the rental program and assuming that those processes around renting out their facilities.
When you did that, sorry to interrupt. When you did that audit for the cash collections and it got to the rental, because they do collect cash for that, they have a schedule that you sign up for or whatever and says, okay, my birthday party is gonna be from whatever time to whatever time. Are you cross-referencing that actually happened? Like, if I sign up, did that event actually happen, or did an event happen that maybe was not on the schedule? Because that accusation has been made to me multiple times, that things are happening, it's not on the schedule, therefore money is not being collected as a favor to people.
That I'm not sure about, and since it is a draft report, I can't talk about it necessarily in the public meeting. But it is a question that I will ask once we get back to the office.
Okay.
Okay. The next one was submitted online. It's the varsity fund spending processes around that fund. We didn't put it on here just because, fortunately, we had so many other competing priorities, but this would just be looking at the money that's going in there and how it's being spent and if it's following the expectations of council who put it in there. Yes.
I guess I would just clarify for the public, I think that it would be the Office of Youth Safety that was created subsequent to a public proposal that was called the Varsity Spending Plan. There is no official Metro thing called the Varsity Spending Plan. That is generated by the public and advocates. I would say something that has grown out of that would be the Office of Youth Safety. So just for clarity, that there's no such fund in Metro.
But there was $1 million that was
Allocated
dedicated
for purposes
to
of the
it.
budget. Right.
And it would be helpful to know what's happening with that $1 million
Yeah.
and who's in charge of it.
So that one was submitted online. The next one is Nashville General Hospital Strategic Planning. This was another submitted idea, just with so much happening at Nashville General Hospital. Look at with their plan to build a new building and the events that are going into that and how are they planning for just their management and all of this other stuff around it. And that one we didn't put on there just because, once again, we're competing priorities. But that was also a submitted one.
Could we just ask them what their strategic plan is?
Well, it'd be also around their process. I mean, as we always do, it's also around the processes. Like, how are they doing it? How are they come up with, how did they plan out their new building and all of that stuff? The next ones were just ideas that we kicked around internally. So, like I said, waste services, backdoor pickup and hauling tickets was a piece of that. But as you pointed out, that's a new director and everything. The health department, animal control operations, it's not an area that we haven't been out to in a while. There were some other audits and other local government audit shops that unfortunately found some unfortunate situations at animal control places. So that was one of the reasons that we thought maybe ours was worth taking a look at, since unfortunately there's lots of animals. The next one was MMPD body-worn cameras, data privacy practices. This is another one that we found in other audit shops with body-worn cameras. How is that information, or how are those videos being maintained? How are they being shared? And how do they make sure that the individuals that are in those videos, their privacy is protected? MMPD's confiscated funds and evidence room. This was one we did years ago, but it had some pretty significant findings, and it's been many years, been remediated, but also just a high-risk area. And so we put it on here as a potential audit.
And it's been how long since you've been there?
How long has it been since that one was done?
No heavens. At least 10.
It was like 10, yeah. The next one, IOD claims, injury on duty claims. It's just a large bucket of money that Metro spends on IOD each year, and just making sure that the processes for claiming IOD and then the approvals and the monitoring of that spending and those claims. I will say that HR has a safety person who is very on top of things, and he's done a lot of changes, and I think that it would almost, he's been there for a while now, and that may be a good place to look at to see how he's doing in that role. County clerk cash handling. We have not been to the county clerk's office in a while. I mean, it's been about, it was one of the ones that it's probably been about 10 years since we've gone out there. And so that was the reason that, since they've taken cash, that was their biggest risk that we kind of associated with them. And last one is overtime, kind of like credit card spending. We had overtime on there because there's a lot of money that's spent on overtime every year. This is another one that we probably haven't done in about, it's probably been over 10 years since we did that one. It is a Metro ride one, so you do have to find out the overtime approval processes for every single department, but focusing on higher risk areas.
It's a great Tennessean article that we get you halfway there.
Yes, exactly. It's a high focus in a lot of different audit shops too, because it's a lot of money that's spent on overtime each year in many different cities, understandably. So those are the other audits.
May I pose a question, Chair,
Please.
just in a general sense? So, for MNPD, Metro Nashville Police, confiscated funds and evidence room, the body-worn cameras, overtime is the Tennessean article, and I think council is keenly aware that the largest amount of overtime is in the police department, and that's somewhat understandable, of course, but I wonder, whether through the audit department, but those metro departments that are identified as really high risk and do have, I just wonder kind of like both sides of the equation, like what kind of standard rotation, right? You don't necessarily wait till like, news article or bad thing, and so we're gonna, but kind of level setting on the expectation. I mean, do you think departments, or are there best practices that, confiscated funds and evidence room, if we just said, we're gonna audit that every 5 years or 10 years, or the body-worn cameras are on this cadence. Like, I just wonder, in such a high-risk area with a lot of things implicated, and balancing year to year to year to year what's in progress versus what needs to be on a pretty regular cadence, and how do we balance that in high-risk departments?
I don't know that there's any best practices. I think the hardest part is those high-risk departments are huge.
Right.
And so sometimes we'll hit on something like confiscated funds where we know that that's a higher risk. Until we did that audit, we may not have known that that was there. So we do try to vary it every year because of the fact that there's so many different parts of, but if we find it, then we probably would go back after, like you said, it's not necessarily a cyclical rotation. I do know that from looking at other local government audit shops, some of the bigger ones, things like that, they would put on a more of an actual routine rotation. It would just almost kind of be like continuous follow-up audits every few years, depending on the size, to make sure that the practices in place are still happening. So I can't give you necessarily best practices, but it is something that we can look into and also kind of map out, because MMPD is not the only high-risk area. There's a lot on here because we touched MMPD, I guess, a couple of years ago, but we haven't been out there since. the harassment audit that is on the audit plan will be involving MMPD, so that was why we were kind of like, well, we're doing something in there this year. But I will also say with the public safety aspect of it, we get more ideas for MMPD because there's so many different points that they have contact with citizens and stuff like that.
Right.
So you were there in '23, but for a different
At
section,
MMPD,
or, yeah.
yes, that would have been the early intervention
Okay.
audit.
So the things that are in the plan for this year or things that were considered are other areas within the police department? Got it, okay.
Well, I think, if I may, Chair, to build on what you suggested, so, we have this risk prioritization that is by department, and we understand when the last audit was, but I think because year to year, we're having to check and, be fair and balanced, make sure we're not, doing too much in this department or another, and then kind of balancing acute issue, elevated, something of concern, we need to be nimble and responsive against kind of just a standard cadence of, we're every decade or every 5 years gonna check, the confiscated funds and evidence room. And, I think I would ask that we maybe just kind of flesh out the risk prioritization matrix, and maybe if there are things that have come up or that we see in peer cities with departments of a large size that could be on a routine cadence, right, but within a few years, such that, okay, well, if we're doing confiscated evidence every 5 years, but you know what, we're right in the midst of a big other thing, what's the window so that doesn't necessarily, and I'm not saying it would, I know y'all keep track of it, but that doesn't fall away, and then all of a sudden, it's been a decade since we've done that because these other things were coming up. I just, so I would respect how you think is the best way to organize that, but
And one of
it
the
seems
things
like
that you actually asked for with our audit website, now we actually have it up. I was going to talk to you about this afterwards. We did set up a web page on our audit site that now does it by department, and so it is much easier to see what we have looked at in each department instead of because our website always had it by fiscal year. So if you knew what fiscal year our audit was done in, that's great. If you didn't, then you were going year by year by year trying to find it. Now we also have it's accompanying that is by department. So you can go through and it tells you the dates of which those other audit reports were issued, which makes it easier if council is looking at it, but also just in general. And it makes it so that we can go back actually and look at it as well and see what we hit to make sure that we aren't missing something like that. Yes.
I appreciate that a lot. I think that's going to be a great improvement. Thank you.
So I had a conversation with Lauren, as I was doing my training for the audit committee, and one of the questions I asked was very similar, Vice Mayor, to what you asked, which was, seems, is there a way that we should be doing certain internal audits on a rotation? And, you are limited that way sometimes when you have limited number of hours in a year. And so that was something I had discussed with Lauren was, how does our internal audit department size and the number of hours we can allocate to do internal audits, how would that compare, with some of our peer cities and things like that? So I think, Lauren, something we need to probably look at and explore is our internal audit department large enough to do the work of a government this size?
I appreciate that. I think that's a good question to ask, right? Yeah, because it's kind of, got the staff that we have for the ones that we have, and how would you,
Yep. And as we discussed, it's very difficult to compare us to other, as any city, because what we have is component units. We have MNPS, which most local governments, a lot of the ones that are our size, they don't necessarily have MNPS, or they don't have the school system, but they have the electric company, or they have other large component units. So trying to find the apples to apples is the difficult part. But for if you just look at budget alone, then we are well undersized. But there's different pieces to it. And so that's what we have to take the time to actually look at.
And internal audit it's very important.
Great.
It's very important. So we support you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. We all do.
And Chair, if I may, I appreciate you going through all of those. And I think on reflection and just kind of in the aggregate, I would concur with Ms. Johnston. We have a new director for waste services who is really getting into all the kind of granular level of some of these things here. As I look at this and kind of think about, well, you know, if I could pick one, and I'm not sure if that's necessarily on the table, but as to parks, kind of recruiting, hiring, I don't know if there's a way to kind of compartmentalize the summer hiring. I think there's just potentially something there because it's a compressed timeline. It's a very concerted time when we do need lifeguards and camp counselors and young people to work at golf courses, and I've continued to hear that it's problematic, like that just how it is organized as to the runway, basically, of calling for the jobs, pricing the jobs, getting people in the queue, and that some of our revenue generating properties are losing the opportunity to have you know, the hours, and these are revenue generating assets. And so if we're not well organized to support the activities there, it's lost revenue, and, you know, potentially it's lost employment for young people in our community. And so I would, while I respect that we are in the midst of the cash collection and that's coming to the end, and a massive holistic look at all the hiring practices, but would you sense that summer hire, or is the larger process implicated, and that's not distinct?
You know, I'm not knowing what their processes are. I would think that summer hiring is going to be different because those are going to be more hourly workers than those that are recruited for salary or for long term. So I would think that we could whittle it down to that. Yes.
Okay. And I apologize, I'm not sure kind of where we are in the order of business, if that's proper to ask for consideration of that, or we want to separate that, Chair. I don't.
No, I think that's the discussion at this
Yep.
point in time, is there, you know, because ultimately what we will do is we will vote to approve the plan
Okay.
before it finished today.
Yep.
So if we want to modify the proposed plan, this is our opportunity to do it.
I guess in deference to you, Chair, I would invite, as far as that suggestion on my part about the summer hire, if other members have thoughts or questions about that, for or against that, I would welcome that.
And let me ask a point of clarification.
Yes.
If we select something of these other audit considerations, does that mean something's got to drop off that's in your proposed plan now?
The proposed plan is what we think we have capacity for. Y'all can add as many audits to it as you want. We would prioritize them. As you all know, we started coming up to the end of it last year when we needed actually to request another audit to be added to the audit plan. So there's potential for that to happen. We can add it without changing anything. It actually gives us the opportunity that if we need to rearrange, if we reach out to a department and they don't have the capability for us to go out there, we can easily slot something else in.
I don't mind adding the parks recruiting and hiring practices, but I don't know that I would want to limit it just to summer. I know they do that in a tranche, sort of, but at the same time, we've got hiring issues in parks across the board.
And it would likely be the same people. So
It's the same people doing the job, 100%. 100%. Yeah.
But we could ask for information on that to be treated separately, with regard to summer as opposed to the
Yes,
rest of it.
yeah. Yeah, so we can add that. To me, I don't know that I would take anything off. To your point, it gives you the ability, like if we're saying we're gonna delay the police department traffic stuff to give them the opportunity, then we can plug this in and, you know, whatever. So do you wanna move that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would, Chair, I don't know if you want to wait to the end or to do that, but yeah, I would move to add the Metro Parks recruiting and hiring practices to the proposed audit plan.
Second.
Yeah, do we wanna, okay, so do we wanna make, do we wanna have this conversation about all of these things that we want to add to it, and then just, you know, if somebody else has a thought process, and because I feel like if we're gonna end up adding like 3 things, then it's just gonna be too much. So we probably need to have a discussion about what we're wanting to add and what we're okay keeping off before we make motions singularly.
Yep, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yep, sure. I can withdraw my motion. Deborah's the chair, yeah, just however you want to manage the discussion, I will withdraw that motion for now, yeah.
I have a generic question. So next year when we're considering the audit plan, is this something maybe you could send out to us, the items that maybe don't make it, you know, so that next year it'll help jog our memory to say, oh yeah, let's put that on the plan.
Yes.
Okay, that would be
And
helpful.
then some of these were on there last year as well. Some of them didn't get
Okay.
carried forward. We removed some because we actually added some to the audit plan last
Okay,
year.
that's fabulous. Thanks, Lauren.
Excuse me, sorry. I mean, the overtime thing, I just think is probably too big to add. I just, you know, to manage that, I think we would have to delete a couple of things. So I don't know that I necessarily want to do that. I mean, there are some things on this audit plan that I'm sort of agnostic about, but.
Yeah, and I would say, if I may, Chair, just to build on that, I think looking at, and again, just based on the Tennessean article that I read today, you know, not wanting MNPD to feel as though like, oh, all these things kind of coming at you, but again, if we're on sort of a standard cadence relative to overtime, to say the departments with the most overtime then get, right, then it's not necessarily prejudicial or, oh, we saw this Tennessean article, it's just sort of like, well, y'all are booking the most overtime, so we're gonna check that. So yeah, same thing, it's like it's sort of like summer hiring versus all the hiring, you know, overtime in one department versus all the overtime in Metro. I mean, it's hard to kind of.
It is. That one's a big
Balance
audit because that, like I said, that is across all of Metro. It's looking at all the different overtime across, and every department does it differently.
Right,
Yes.
right, which might
Is a
be worth,
problem.
which might be worth looking at generally of like, why does every department do it differently? Yeah, I mean, I think that remains something that is certainly top of mind for council and the public, but I do concur that's a big one. So,
But probably too big to add without taking something off.
right, right.
As I look at your list, the one that I see on there that, from an audit perspective, the confiscated funds and evidence room, you've not been there in a long time and you found problems the last time you were there, that one would concern me. That was also an area that I think lends itself to potentially fraud or misappropriation.
I'm all right with it.
Yep. And Chair, if I may pose a question as well, just generally. So stuff that is on the proposed annual audit plan, I understand in the aggregate doesn't go above 10,000 hours with your overall capacity at 11,000 hours. And without being overly prescriptive, because I know once you get in there, things change. But I think something that would be helpful in kind of making this determination is, without painting yourself into the corner, but anticipated hours, right? Because if you look at all these, just, I mean, you can sort of suss out, oh, that's fairly discrete, that's a small program, that's only gonna take, but I don't have enough insight to understand, oh, that would be 500 hours versus 1,000 hours. And so as I try to kind of, you know, make the case maybe to add a few in, of course, certainly looking to you to say, whoop, that would be a big one, but I don't know if it's worthwhile or you have assessed in adding up to 10,000 hours, how this kind
How they
of
fall.
1 through 12/13 breaks down.
Yes. And we can definitely add that in there. Because even as we were speaking before you arrived, one of the ones we talked about was the harassment, discrimination, and retaliation investigation processes.
Yeah.
And the request to add MMPS to that. And how the hours on that will increase because it's already a large audit as it is.
Yeah.
And so that would also increase.
So since we've added MMPS to number 7 with the harassment, yada yada, and then I think we're all in agreement to adding the parks recruiting and hiring practices, and we also are interested in a confiscated funds and evidence room from a high-risk perspective. Would it be appropriate, since we're wanting to delay traffic enforcement anyway, to just remove that and put in the confiscated funds, and that way we're adding some things, but at least we can take it away to sort of balance the scales?
That's probably a good idea. As well as then, at least with MMPD, we're coming in there for one and not potentially
And not-
another one 6 months later.
Right, two,
Yes.
correct, yep.
That's a good idea. I like
Yeah, I
it.
like that too.
Other thoughts or comments?
No, but so I can go ahead and make the motion consolidated. I think I could do it. So a motion to add MNPS to the Metro government harassment, discrimination, and retaliation investigation processes, add Metro Parks recruiting and hiring processes, add Metro Nashville Police Department confiscated funds and evidence room, and remove Metro Nashville Police Department traffic enforcement to this year's audit plan.
One more was adding Historic Zoning Commission to Historic Commission.
Clarify.
Oh, and clarifying the historic zoning commission versus the commission itself in that particular audit.
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. You have your plan.
Thank you. We're
It's
excited.
work.
We're excited to get working on it. It's fun putting it together because it's all these ideas that we have and exciting new things to do. Okay, so next is our recommendation implementation. Since our last meeting, we had 26 recommendations that came due. Most of them, 12/31 has been since our last meeting. 4 of them were reported as implemented, 22 were not. 18 of those relate to the disaster recovery audit that we had, and it's because ITS and OEM worked together to engage Barry Dunn to do some work to determine how to best implement the recommendations that were within that report. Barry Dunn is in the midst of doing that work, so they cannot implement those until Barry Dunn is done with their work. So that was why there is a delay or a revised date for those. There's 3 that relate to the public records request audit that we did with the Metro Clerk's office. Unfortunately, they are a small staff. They've been working with us and very responsive throughout them trying to get these implemented, except they've just hit a high level of turnover for their small office, and they have not been able to prioritize our recommendations. They're working towards them, but they just need more time. And the last one was related to public property. They implemented 2 of the recommendations that were due. There was just 1 more related to documentation retention. Since we did that audit, public property moved from being under finance to being under general services. And in that move, it now means that general services are responsible for our recommendations. So general services is getting their arms around, some of them were already done before they had moved, but now that general services has it, it's identifying the processes and policies around that documentation and then getting it put together. But they are working towards implementing that one, and just ask for a little more time. Okay. Next, we have our project status. This is the last one you'll see for this audit plan year. So this is where we're ending the year at. We had 11 projects that are currently active. 4 of those are in draft reporting. We did hit our goal of issuing 15 reports. It was 14 audit reports and 1 investigation. Until we hired our lead investigator, it meant that all of our work, if we had investigations, it pulled us away from audits, but we were still successful.
Is this our lead investigator?
Yes, it is.
Hello.
But so we were able to get those out. We did have 15 total hotline alerts. Unfortunately, that's less than what we anticipated. We're trying to build up this program, but that's also why we have hired this person to help build it up. So hopefully next year, though we went down this year, hopefully next year it'll go up. And we have 4 active allegations that are currently being looked into, or hotline, I guess we call them hotline, even though they come in many different forms. But those are still open. Any questions on our project status? Okay. Next is our annual performance review, or our annual report. Part of our bylaws is that every year we will send out a report to council to kind of let them know about our accomplishments. And so that's what this is provided to you all for informational purposes. It's what will be sent out later this week in PDF format to the Metro Council. It just covers our audit committee. It covers the great work that our staff does all year. And it gives us the ability to kind of brag on ourselves and show all the different places and all the different audits that we've done. It's much prettier when it has color, but
I was gonna say, you should have done this in color.
I've got it in color. I printed mine out ahead of time. I'll show everybody. Here's the pretty color. Thank you, Elise Waller, for printing this for me. And put it in a binder.
And it also covers our performance measures that are put in place by the Office of Performance Management and the Mayor's Office. We did meet all of our goals with the exception of our fraud, waste, and abuse tips, which I did realize when I was printing this that technically we met the goal. It was 15. Their annual report needs to be edited. That one did go up as it was shown in the project status report. So we did meet it, but we want to be trending upwards, not down. And so that will be sent out.
Just as a, sort of unrelated, I understand when you guys do an audit and you're talking to employees or whoever, that there are some topics that come up that are sort of out of your purview and that are maybe more HR related or something like that. When that happens, what are we doing to make sure that HR is appropriately, well, number one, handling it at all, number two, handling it appropriately, and especially taking into account the protection of that particular employee to prevent any type of retaliation? Are we following up on that, or how are we holding, I mean, quite frankly, how are we holding HR accountable for what they should be doing?
So we haven't gotten we've gotten a number of allegations recently related to that, and it actually has opened our eyes to that very question. One, we have that audit that's on the audit plan that we do hope to learn more about that process. Two, another thing that we've discussed internally is we're setting up meetings with HR and we're setting up meetings with Metro Legal, because there are two pieces to this. It's not just sending people to HR, it's also making sure that when we talk to them that we can offer them the protections that they deserve, and that's where we have the conversation. We're going to have a conversation with Metro Legal at some point to make sure that we understand what protections we can tell them about and the confidentiality around it. Now, in the past, when we've gotten these through our hotline, if it's HR related, we would pass it over to a contact in HR and ask them to let us know how they plan to handle it. Past that, we haven't necessarily followed up, and it is, like I said, as we've gotten more recently, it's been more eye-opening that maybe we should be doing more.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I'm wondering if, as you're looking at this audit for retaliation and all that, looking at previous complaints with folks that are no longer with Metro, whether they've retired or maybe not fired, because there's always maybe, obviously we don't want that necessarily to shade anything. But I just think, I know that there's been serious problems with retaliation, and there is a massive amount of fear around saying what they need to say in order to make the improvements that need to be made, whatever that is, and not lose their job, lose their pension. You know, I mean, I know specific, and I think I told you, a guy that was almost 30 years with Metro, and I specifically sent him to HR saying you can trust this person, and within 30 minutes he was called into the director's office. So you know, I just want you to get good information and have people feel comfortable knowing that when they are telling you things, that that they're gonna be protected, and that if they aren't protected, what are we doing when there is retaliation? Because, you know, it can happen, it's like, oops, sorry, damn. You know, but it's like, no, somebody's gonna be held accountable if that retaliation happens, and if something, you know, we need to figure that out. Because if there's no enforcement, if there's no punishment, then it doesn't matter.
Yep. And that was one of the objectives that was listed on there, was as far as making sure the communication after an investigation is done is properly done, and that the.
Yeah, and what do we need to look at it from a policy perspective on, you know, we always say like, and what comes to mind right now is MNPD, but of like, well, we have this policy, and if you don't do this policy, then you're gonna be handled with this law, or you're gonna be terminated, or yada, yada. Well, it's very prescriptive. And so I think we need to figure out what's prescriptive from director on down. Like, this is not gonna be tolerated, and how can you help guide that policy? Because I think I know that it's necessary.
Yeah, and I mean, even we've had this conversation. Unfortunately, Metro does lose employees after a while when they get beaten down. They don't feel like they're being heard, and that's something to consider. And that was one of the importance of putting that audit on the audit plan.
Yeah.
And I think, to your point, Ms. Johnson, about whether we, you know, have kind of the exit interview option, right? Where, you know, sadly, if we do lose someone because they just felt they could never get traction in a good faith space to try to obviate some problems and got lateralized and demoralized and just finally left, like sometimes that just lives, you know, in my brain and in my notes or yours, or, you know, they've reached out often to a council member in frustration because they did not feel like they could effectuate the needed change. It puts council members in very awkward positions, much like you shared of like, no, I promise you it'll be you know, and I just, you know, not necessarily even in a space of, you know, this really bad high-risk thing is being done, but sometimes even in just a proactive, I think this process would be improved if it were done this way. Now, what I think that also sometimes does is it goes to leadership and culture in a department and some of those managerial aspects, but I just, you know, I feel like 9 years in
But when you have that culture that continually pushes down people that are challenging that, you know, it just gets worse. It's just a cancer that continues to grow.
It is.
And you do lose good people. And I don't understand why we're not doing exit interviews with everyone. The private sector does that. Like, it was not an option when I left Deutsche Bank 400 years ago. I was like, I don't want to do an exit review. They were like, yeah, it's really not optional. You have to go talk to HR. And they had certain questions, and you answer the questions, and you can handle it however you want to, but the interview had to happen. And I feel like that is helpful to know, you know, sort of where you're going, and especially if you get the same complaint over and over again that shows there's some consistency in this messed upness, if that's a word. You know, like, we need to address this, and I know that we need to address it, and so I'm really looking forward to the results of that audit and hopefully having. And I really don't like for council to make a habit of creating super interdepartmental policy, because I think, you know, like, we have our job and they have their job, and they have their job for a reason. Like, I'm not gonna micromanage you because you know finance, I don't necessarily, well, I kinda do know finance, but that was a bad example. I don't know the law, so I'm not gonna micromanage you, but you know, that's not my job to micromanage. But however, I do think you know, there's an opportunity there where we could have some overarching policy around retaliation and holding people accountable for that.
Great.
The next thing is our budget. We're 43% of our budget, and that's without the targeted that's taking the targeted savings away. So we are operating well. We're about to have a couple of big things come out, such as training, because our big annual training that we all attend is gonna happen soon, as well as some continuing with our consulting fees. But we're spending it better than we have in the past because we now actually have those contracts in place to utilize our consultants.
Maybe you should give yourself a raise.
Actually, y'all are the ones who have to give me a raise. It's in my letter.
Yeah, we vote yes.
And then the last thing is our staffing. Oh, and actually, I'll touch on one thing with the budget. We did submit our budget request last week. We have requested one additional person. We're trying to grow. Additionally, that entails additional costs with software and computer equipment and everything else that goes along with it. And so that's other accompanying requests that we had with that.
I certainly hope the mayor grants that. I mean, obviously, what the mayor puts in is pretty close to what passes. We have very little influence over it, but
That's good
I
to
think
know.
for a while, you were having trouble hiring, and I think you have
Yes.
gotten over that hump, and there's people applying and good people, and
Yes.
so hopefully that will be granted for you.
And for staffing, we still have our one vacant position. We posted it, it closed on January 31st. This morning, we got our pool of candidates. We hope to go through them quickly and get interviews set up so that by the end of May, we have an offer out there. And then we would be fully staffed.
Awesome.
12, so you're
Yes.
looking to go to 13.
Yeah. And then we're requesting to go to 13, yes.
Gotcha, about it.
Lucky number 13.
Exactly, and so that's all I've got.
Chair, if, when you send this internal audit report to council, much like last time, thank you, when you did kind of the call for input, you did the link out to the website with the annual, but with the update of audits by department, would you highlight that in your email for council members, just so they know that that's a new pathway? I think committee chairs especially will appreciate, the ability to just kind of go and say, okay, what's under my oversight umbrella? What are these departments? So, yes, I would just ask when sending that, if you would highlight that, that'd be great.
Any other questions, considerations for the public meeting? Public meeting is now adjourned.